Last chapter, I talked about the traumas of 1968, talked about the Tet Offensive in particular, and how the communists launched a surprise attack that we should have seen coming but didn't. And the media focused on the surprise of the attack as opposed to how we were able to effectively beat it back. And in essence, I said that that's where America lost the war. What I meant by that was that's where America lost public opinion in America. It lost America's societal will to continue support in our efforts there, which inevitably would lead to our exit from Vietnam. But as the 1968 election had unveiled, of course, you had Hubert Humphrey, you had the assassination of RFK and whatnot. Richard Nixon had run on a campaign that he would run as a peacemaker. He would do something about Vietnam. Didn't know exactly what, but he wanted to do something. He was inaugurated in January of 1969. By that summer, America finally reached its peak involvement in Vietnam with 543,000 servicemen overseas in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam. So, with the war continuing to escalate and deaths continuing to mount, that's where Richard Nixon decided that he was going to do something about his campaign promise. So, with the help of one of his top advisors, Henry Kissinger, who would eventually become Secretary of State, he began a process called Vietnamization. You see, Nixon ran on that peacemaker ideology. However, despite growing calls for America to pull troops out of Vietnam and end our involvement there, we've made a promise to South Vietnam that we would protect and defend them, monetarily and otherwise. You can't just logistically also take 540,000 troops overnight. Oh, that's it, you're on. You have to begin a process of de escalating our involvement there. All the while building up South Vietnamese regular army troops and Marines and implementing them in greater numbers so as to fight their own fight in the first place. Okay? That's the idea of Vietnamization that Richard Nixon has. And beginning in the summer of 1969, he commissions 60,000 American troops to come back home. We are going to slowly, in a stair-step fashion, pull troops out of Vietnam, and we're going to slowly but surely further train and hand over the reins of the military fighting capability unto the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. So that was the idea, because Nixon had the idea that we would make a peaceful exit. That's going to come a little bit later. But otherwise, though, the idea of de-escalating our involvement starts with Vietnamization. You can't just arbitrarily up and leave your ally that you've sworn to protect just high and dry. You've got to keep your word and your honor while also working your worldwide angle to maintain your prestige and maintain your image, if you will. Okay? If you just up and leave, one, you left your client state just high and dry so as to supposedly defend your ideals, but when the going gets tough, you just run and hide. It's not exactly going to thwart off communism. And then also, your prestige factor. You're the world's biggest superpower in conjunction with the Soviet Union. You have to maintain that status. If you take a hit to your reputation, that's going to threaten your overall worldwide validity and reputation. You can't have that. It's like having a credit card that you default on. You've got to keep making your payments. So, from that standpoint, that's where Vietnamization comes in. And Henry Kissinger, a former Harvard professor, by the way, comes to the biggest aid. And Nixon trusts Henry Kissinger so much that he basically tells the Secretary of State to kind of stay out of the way. This guy Kissinger knows what he's doing as far as negotiations are concerned and as far as advisement is concerned. However, even though by the end of 1969, Vietnamization is in full swing, by the spring of 1970, we had still not fully de escalated our involvement. We were still engaging in offensive operations from a militaristic standpoint in South Vietnam. One of the complaints from the American public, from military commanders, and from the troops themselves were the limitations that were placed into the rules of engagement in Vietnam from the first day, from years before. Since our days of advisement to the days that we escalated our involvement in 1965, 66, the search and destroy years. Okay, the rules of engagement, even though the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were infiltrating into Laos and Cambodia via the Ho Chi Minh Trail to smuggle arms and munitions into South Vietnam from the north, even though they were doing that, one of the rules of engagement was we were not to cross South Vietnam's sovereign borders. We were not going to cross into North Vietnam. We were not going to cross into Laos or Cambodia. Basically, you're fighting a war on somebody else's territory with one arm tied behind your back. So even though we were beating back major military engagements by the North Vietnamese and the VC, it could have been different. Had the United States actually been able to go into Cambodia and Laos, there might be a different story. The fear at the time, and why the rule of engagement was implemented in the first place, was that, there was a fear that the Chinese and Soviets would become involved, and you would further escalate this war into a grander scale. And you could potentially start World War III right there in Indochina. So as not to further escalate the war, we decide to keep all operations within South Vietnam. That doesn't mean we can't bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Doesn't mean we can't bomb targets in North Vietnam or in Cambodia or Laos, because we do. We just don't send uniformed troops in there. Okay. That begins to change. In part, it changes in the spring of 1970 when American military commanders identify various different communist command centers, not more than 5, 10, 20 miles just inside Cambodia from the South Vietnamese border. There are several different locations, possible munitions, secret bases, all kinds of stuff that exist that have potentially been uncovered. The only way to actually get to them would be to send troops. Well, our rules of engagement prohibit us from doing that. Until Richard Nixon utilizes executive powers and in April 1970 decides to get out ahead of media attention, and he unveils a plan for U.S. troops to temporarily head into Cambodia. We are going to seize control and command of various different communist command structures and munitions and whatnot as they've been identified. That would be our justification for going into Vietnam. And the way Nixon saw it was, if we get out in front of this, then the firestorm that will inevitably follow is going to be a little bit lesser of a firestorm. We'll be able to control the narrative as opposed to out of control media or protesters or whatever have you. Fact of the matter is, we're finally going into forbidden territory. We are finally going into Cambodia. American troop morale was decimated by 1970. Really, after the Tet Offensive, and the way that the American public had lost its support for the war, American troops felt that. And they felt like they were fighting for a losing cause. And this kind of re-energized a little bit. Finally, we're going into Cambodia. And Richard Nixon goes on public television and he announces exactly where our troops are going to go, basically, which regions and whatnot. And he declares that United States troops will not go deeper than 19 nautical miles into Cambodia from South Vietnam. Okay. And as he's doing so, American troops are on their way. And within a couple hours, American troops actually going into Cambodia, um, a regiment of U.S. Army troops uncovers an absolute massive stockpile of munitions, AK-47s, weaponry, artillery, other sorts of weaponry. It was obvious that this stockpile was going to be used for some sort of major offensive, kind of like the Tet Offensive. And U.S. troops uncover it. And the stockpile was so big that when they go to collect everything, they can't even burn it all at once because it's so massive. They nickname it the city because it is so massive. Okay? Military commanders leave a few platoons behind to guard the stockpile while the rest of them make their way further in. They've identified a communist command center just a few miles down the way. You know what can happen if U.S. troops take command of this center, or if they destroy it, or if they overtake it? That could potentially be really big. Okay? That could do a lot of significant damage to communist forces. Taking their stockpile and destroying it, that's a huge blow right there for the communists. Okay? You're making headway. Until American military commanders just about a mile or so away from this communist center are told to cease operations immediately and go back to South Vietnam. Reason why was because news of our Cambodia invasion reignites a firestorm of anti-war sentiment that had been de-escalating since Nixon took office. Nixon promised to de-escalate the war, and he was via his Vietnamization process until he identified the opportunity. And the invasion of Cambodia was deemed by media types and by protesters as potentially being a re-escalation of our involvement in Southeast Asia when we were promised nothing of the such would happen. We had plenty of troops being removed from the countryside, but you stepped over into Cambodia. So that was now being seen as an escalation. All kinds of protests and riots now start taking place, largely centered on college campuses. And the most notorious one occurred in early May 1970 on the campus of Kent State University, that's in Ohio. In order to break up a massive riot and protest on Kent State's campus, the Ohio National Guard was called in. And somehow, in some way, the Ohio National Guard fired several shots unto the rioting public and killed 4 students at Kent State. I don't know how or why that happened. I don't know why the National Guard got so out of control. I don't know if it was just some zealot within the National Guard. I have no idea. But it became readily obvious that this is going to be a big problem. There are other universities across the country where riotous action was taking place, and you could reignite that firestorm that had been quieted for a while. So, as U.S. troops were on their way to that communist command center in Cambodia, Richard Nixon himself calls commanders and says, cease operations, return to South Vietnam. We were within a mile. We stopped. We could have done even more significant damage than what we had already done. That's your whole objective for going to war. You want to cripple your opponent. Unless you add in political rules of engagement. And National Guard troops, they don't really control themselves at Kent State. Other things begin to be uncovered as well. The next year in 1971, the United States had begun a process of not just Vietnamization, but they had ceased taking offensive operations. They were no longer going out and searching for North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. They were taking strictly defensive postures, and the South Vietnamese army would be operating on offensives. But it came out in 1971 via a report called the Pentagon Papers that essentially the United States government, going back to the Eisenhower administration, had somewhat been lying and falsifying numbers and involvements and reasons for escalations in Vietnam. Every presidential administration, the Eisenhower administration, the JFK administration, especially the LBJ administration, and the Nixon administration, had all been somewhat falsifying the numbers. Things weren't going as well as what were said. And it was also uncovered that the North Vietnamese and VC were initiating 80% of all the contact with U.S. troops. It's hard to find them, yeah. It's hard to justify a body count when you don't have actual territory gained. As the Pentagon Papers become publicly known and leaked, it becomes more and more obvious that the American public is going to further plummet their support for the war. And that gets back to U.S. troops. For several years, especially going back to the My Lai massacre, U.S. troops have taken the bitter resentment that the American public had about our war in Vietnam. And the American public blamed American troops. They saw American troops as the reason why there's destruction in the world. American troops took the blame and a lot of backlash upon return home. Think about this. You might be an American serviceman. You just spent 13 months in Vietnam. You saw all kinds of violence, your friends dying, people blown up with ghastly wounds, all kinds of different stuff. You come home, and the people that welcome you back are spitting on you, throwing eggs at you. American servicemen paid a massive price in Vietnam. All they did was answer the call that their country made to them. The overwhelming majority of them did so valiantly, yet they were blamed. That's one of the other wrongs of the Vietnam War. You blame the troops, blame the politicians who put them there. Don't blame the people who are called to serve. That's one of the lessons that was learned in Vietnam. And morale among U.S. troops was low. You had racial tensions. You had recent integration with civil rights the prior decade. A lot of tension among immigration, or rather integration. And then further, you had drugs that would make their way from America to South Vietnam. So a lot of rear echelon troops especially had access to marijuana and LSD and other things. There was a morale problem. Whereas in 1966, every Marine and every soldier was on board. We're going to kill those communists, we're going to lick them, and we're going to go back home. 1971, 5 years later, you're fighting for a lost cause. Okay? And in the spring of 1972, that offensive that I was talking about, how United States troops had uncovered that massive stockpile of weapons 2 years earlier in Cambodia. That now happened again in the spring of 1972 when North Vietnamese troops led another offensive among major South Vietnamese military installations and cities all throughout South Vietnam. So basically, the United States uncovering weapons stalled a major communist offensive for 2 years. Okay, the Easter offensive was beaten back, but the point is clear. The communists are making headway, and things are not going to get better.